Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We are here to resume a hearing in docket numbers 2023-16-E and 2023-17-E. These dockets involve the 2023 avoided cost proceeding for Duke Energy Carolinas LLC and Duke Energy Progress LLC. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Carolee Williams. In the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. I note for the record that when we had our earlier proceeding, that Commissioner Irvin and Commissioner Powers were on leave and therefore are not participating in today's proceeding. I recognize our staff counsel to read the docket.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and other commissioners, we're here for the continuation of the proceeding in docket number 2023-16-E and 2023-17-E, which concerns the avoided cost of Duke Energy Carolinas LLC and Duke Energy Progress LLC. Madam Chair, this proceeding is scheduled to resume this morning, October 9th at 10 a.m.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Let's take appearances from the parties. Who's representing Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress?
Good morning, Madam Chair. On behalf of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress, I'm Sam Wellborn. My co-counsel this morning is Tracy DeMarco of McGuire Woods, and I understand Brett Brightshort is joining us online. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wellborn. And intervener, Converse Energy?
Good morning, Madam Chair. Charlie Terani for Converse Energy.
Thank you. And Office of Regulatory Staff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ben Muschin and Donna Rainey.
Thank you. I note that we had a motion to strike testimony. We dealt with that somewhat at our commission business meeting last week, and we'll address it further in our final order. Mr. Wellborn, when we get to your witness, please remind me we have some confidential exhibit, I think, that has not been addressed yet, and so we'll need to address that at that time. Need you to remind me of that. Any further preliminary matters before we begin? Okay, hearing none. Is Mr. Goulding on the line? Good morning, Mr. Goulding. Can you hear me? Okay, I think we may have a technical issue. Let's see what we would.
Chair Belser, the technical issue is over.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. You can hear us?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Goulding, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Good morning to you. I note for the record that Mr. Goulding is president of London Economics International, LLC. He was hired as the Commission's independent third-party consultant for this matter, and will be the main focus of this morning is for him to present his report, and we will proceed with that. Mr. Goulding, I'm going to ask you to raise your right hand and let me swear you in as a witness, please. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I so affirm.
Thank you. And Mr. Goulding, would you state your name and position for the record, even though I've just introduced you?
Yes, my name is A.J. Goulding, and I'm the president of London Economics International, LLC.
Thank you. And did you file and file with the commission a report? I think you filed an original report on September 11th regarding your analysis of the Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress avoided cost filings?
Yes, I did.
And then on September 22nd, did you file a revised report with certain corrections to that report?
Yes, I did.
Okay. I need to put the report in the record. Is everything that was in the original report is in the revised report, is it not? Just a few corrections?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so we really only need the September 22nd revised report in the record. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree.
Parties, do you agree with that?
I agree with that, Madam Chair. I would just respectfully remind the chair of our outstanding, excuse me, motion to strike and wouldn't want to, I'd like to preserve the objection. Motion to
You've
strike.
not waived your motion to strike.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Anything else on the report? We will take the revised report of London Economics that is dated September 22nd, 2023. We will mark that for identification as hearing exhibit 10 and receive that into the evidence of this case. Okay. Now, Mr. Goulding, I'm going to ask that you present your findings and tell us what you need to tell us about your report, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll start just with my background. I realize that you've heard this before, but I suspect that you need it for this particular proceeding as well. So I have over 30 years of experience in the energy and power sector, generally focusing on regulatory and market design. Now, in addition to my previous work in South Carolina as an independent consultant with regards to avoided cost calculations, I've advised on electricity market design issues worldwide, including in several U.S. states and provinces and across Canada. Examples include regulatory reviews in Kansas, Hawaii, and Indiana, both on behalf of state legislatures and industry groups. Similarly, in Canada, I've been active with regards to regulatory and market design issues in Alberta and Ontario since the inception of competitive power markets in both jurisdictions. Outside of North America, I've worked around the world, particularly in Asia and the Middle East. Now, in addition to my consulting work, I also teach a graduate level course in electricity markets and regulatory matters across the value chain at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, where I also oversee graduate workshops. In addition, and relevant in particular to this proceeding, I have significant experience with small hydro facilities, having managed a fleet of such facilities on behalf of an LEI client since 2008. I've been involved in PERPA-related engagements throughout my career, including working on reviews of PERPA calculations on behalf of both regulators and qualifying facilities. This has involved reviews of avoided costs, as well as an assessment of associated charges that QFs may face. LEI uses proprietary modeling tools to assess potential market outcomes in North American regions. LEI's pool mod has been used not only in every U.S. region and active Canadian market, but worldwide in Latin America and Asia. The model has been in continuous use since the early 1990s. LEI used pool mod in this engagement to test bands of reasonableness around proposed avoided cost calculations and associated elements. LEI's mandate in this particular engagement was to evaluate the avoided cost rates, methodologies, terms, calculations, and conditions proposed by the utilities. LEI's scope of work includes reviewing all filings on the PSC docket management system, including all pre-filed testimony, verifying the avoided cost methodology and calculations included in all parties' testimony, if necessary, filing data requests with the parties, and writing and filing the consultant's independent report. Now, LEI is the only party to this proceeding that is not represented by legal counsel. LEI has had no contact with any party in the proceeding, including the commission or its staff, with regards to interpreting its scope or defining topics to cover in its report. Let me talk briefly about the guiding principles. We approached this engagement with several touchstones in mind. First, that all modeling and forecast has a degree of uncertainty that surrounds it. And this degree of uncertainty means that we need to provide the benefit of the doubt to those that are making their submissions within a reasonable range. And so LEI applies a zone of reasonableness that's meant to reflect the uncertainty surrounding the various input assumptions and the modeling engine itself that is based on the uncertainty that we see, the degree of accuracy of the models of the U.S. national labs. Ultimately, LEI did not seek to reach exactly the same number of the applicants, but was satisfied if LEI's own calculations were within approximately 10% of those presented in the applications. This threshold is the same as what LEI used in evaluating the avoided costs presented in the prior 2021 proceeding. Now, in addition, settlements influence views as to what is just and reasonable. From the standpoint of regulatory efficiency, negotiated settlements and the lack of ratepayer interventions are one means of assessing whether stakeholders themselves regard an outcome as just and reasonable. As such, while LEI has identified areas of divergence between its views and those of the applicants, LEI largely defers to the settlement as being reasonable. Now, a third touchstone is that the use of public data supports transparency. And as such, LEI has utilized only publicly available data in its calculations. Now, where this has resulted in diverging calculations, LEI has identified the source of those differences. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Finally, context matters. Calculations cannot be performed in a vacuum. Understanding developments in the jurisdiction is important as a means of assuring that the calculations are relevant. So LEI's approach for each of the calculations, avoided energy costs, avoided capacity costs, and SISC, was to deploy quantitative and qualitative tools to assess whether the proposed values fell within a zone of reasonableness, noting that a settlement has been reached among the parties. Where proposed values fell outside of the zone of reasonableness, LEI examined additional scenarios to explore differences in key drivers. Let me talk a little bit about our conclusions. First, LEI found that the Duke Company's proposed avoided energy costs are reasonable. Second, LEI found that the Duke Company's approach to calculating avoided capacity costs is reasonable. However, using publicly available data on broadly based indices, LEI was unable to substantiate that the avoided capacity costs were reasonable. Now, at the time that LEI issued its report, LEI recommended further substantiation of the company's inflation factors, but not rejection of the proposed values. Having reviewed the rebuttal testimony that has been submitted by the companies, LEI is satisfied with regards to the explanation, but would add a few additional comments. One of our concerns with the use of confidential surveys like this is it's more difficult to test things like the sample size and the quality of the survey. That's not to suggest that it was not performed by a reputable firm, but merely to point out that there are certain details that are unavailable to us. However, we do note that if we look at the PPI-Electric Power and Specialty Transformer Manufacturing Index, we find numbers that are not dissimilar from those presented by the applicant. We continue to believe, for a variety of reasons, that those are on the high side. We wouldn't normally use an index that is this specific as an inflator, and we note that in many of the calculations of net cone that the ISOs provide, that they use more broadly based indices. But that said, our effort here is not to say that there's only one right way of doing things. And we also observe that the companies have no reason to exaggerate the costs that are used to calculate the avoided capacity costs. Taking into account all of these factors, LEI is inclined to recommend acceptance of the calculations that were presented by Duke. And this is consistent with the observation that the lack of concerns raised by interveners with regards to the level of avoided capacity costs suggests that stakeholders themselves may believe it to be just and reasonable. Now, with regards to the SISC, LEI believes that the proposed charges are reasonable. There were no material information requests that were not adequately fulfilled by the Duke companies. Now, we'd like to make a few more observations with regards to our report. We note that because the proposed rates are differentiated by hours, those resources providing power during the hours of greatest value already receive a different rate based on avoided costs in those specific hours. So that means that there already is a differentiation with regards to what is paid to particular technologies, but it's grounded in avoided costs. And the challenge from a PURPA perspective is that technology-specific rates may not reflect avoided costs. So the best that you can do is to try and match the load profile of a particular technology and calculate the avoided costs for the hours in which that technology is operating. Effectively, that's what the rates already do. Now, policymakers are free to use measures other than PURPA to incentivize particular technologies. But the methodology for calculating the compensation would not be based in avoided costs. Now, we would also note that because certain intermittent facilities are charged an integration charge, those with less unexpected volatility already receive a higher net price under the proposed arrangements in South Carolina. Finally, ultimately, our mandate is to review avoided cost calculations. That means it is not LEI's job to make sure that every resource that wants to make money does so under the rates offered. That is not part of PURPA. LEI's job was to assess avoided cost calculations. Bills to final consumers are not avoided costs. Such bills include a range of other expenses across the value chain that do not relate to the wholesale cost of energy. For example, such bills include the cost of wires infrastructure. They include significant capital expenditure to maintain and expand those distribution wires. So using final customer bills and the change in final customer bills over time to look at the way in which you would expect avoided costs to change is an apples to oranges comparison. Much of the change in avoided costs has been due to changes in the cost to underlying technologies and to changes in natural gas prices. Those drivers affect only a small part of the final customer bill. With that, I complete my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Goulding. Duke Energy Carolinas, questions for Mr. Goulding?
No, Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Converse Energy, questions for Mr. Goulding? Mr. Turanian, is that microphone on?
Now it is.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Goulding. There you are. My name is Charlie Turani. I represent Converse Energy. I don't believe we've met before, but I've had the pleasure of reviewing your report. And I've just got a few questions for you that I hope you can help us clear up. On page 15 of your report, there is a chart of rates. And they're differentiated by interconnection to distribution and interconnection to transmission. Could you explain the difference between being interconnected to distribution and being interconnected to transmission?
Yes. Generally, the difference is based on voltage, and the difference, the reason that you might want to differentiate is because of the implications for line losses, that you're going to have different line losses to the final consumer based on whether you're connected at a transmission level or a distribution level.
If you're connected, would it be fair to say that generally a larger facility would be connected to the transmission level than the distribution level?
As a broad generalization, that's correct. I mean, there are circumstances where a facility, particularly one that has a large host and is primarily serving that host, might be connected at the distribution level. Also, the definition of distribution and transmission can differ from system to system, but I think I would broadly agree with your characterization.
And a small QF that's connected at the distribution level, as a practical matter, would that QF be able to choose whom it sells energy to?
So there are a variety of arrangements, and some of this is technical and some of it is driven by state law. Now, in states where we have a traditional rate-regulated structure, it's possible that regardless of the level of your interconnection, there will be significant limitations on your ability to sell to third parties. There are ways that you can structure distribution-connected arrangements so that you can sell to third parties, and other states have done so. That is, to the best of my understanding, not currently the case in South Carolina.
Well, and I should have narrowed my question to South Carolina, and specifically a utility like Converse that's connected at the distribution level rather than the transmission level. As a practical matter, do you know if Converse would be able to choose to sell to a different utility?
So just, and I apologize, I'm not trying to be cute here. I wouldn't call Converse a utility.
No, I said sell to a different utility. I'm sorry. I wouldn't call Converse a utility either. I don't want us to be confused.
Yes, yeah. So as a QF, it's my understanding that under current law in South Carolina, speaking as an economist, not as a lawyer.
Yes, sir.
That Converse has no practical way of selling to anybody other than to the utility.
Thank you.
To the applicants.
Thank you for that. You discussed in your report on page 18 an administrative charge, and I'll be honest with you, it went more or less unremarked on in our previous hearing, but you point out that a monthly administrative charge for DEC is going to be raised from $11.07 per month to $22.82 per month. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And these seller charges were described, and I think you were quoting DEC, that the charges are intended to ensure that the cost of supporting and billing the purchase of power from QFs are appropriately recovered from the QF and not passed along to other customers as part of the retail cost of service. Did I recite that correctly?
Yes.
So the administrative charge, would it be fair for the administrative charge to provide, to cover the cost of providing metering equipment for the small QFs?
So one of the challenges with metering and one of the challenges with the avoided cost calculations is whether the metering costs are fully captured in the avoided cost calculation or not. And clearly, there are metering costs for all generation that's on the system, company-owned, non-company-owned. It's not unusual for these charges to be separated out for third parties. And indeed, in my opinion, it's appropriate for charges to be unbundled to the point where you can understand exactly what you're being charged for. So my preference is to have charges clearly stated, so that you don't have a whole bunch of things rolled up into a single bundle, and to have them linked in some broad way, understanding that it can be difficult to allocate costs among various functions within a utility, but ideally to have the costs linked to the charges in some reasonably transparent fashion.
Well, I appreciate that answer, but the question was, would the administrative charge cover the cost of metering, special metering equipment for the QF? If you don't know, you don't know. I mean, seems like this would be that bundle you were talking about.
So I would be inclined, and I appreciate your observation that if you don't know, you should say no. That's clear. But my initial take is to say that from the way that the charge is described, it's possible there are additional metering charges that are not covered in that charge. But I'm not going to speak with certainty. I'm not quoting from any particular document.
Fair enough. And do you think it would be reasonable for a utility selling, now I said it, a QF selling power to a utility to have a meter that allows it to transparently understand what it is being paid for and when?
So metering technology has evolved a great deal since many facilities were installed, and costs have come down substantially. So I don't think it is unreasonable, on the one hand, for the QF to request transparency in terms of metering, whether that is being able to see the outcome of what the meter is recording, or to have itemized statements each month that record on a more granular level the quantity and price. Now, there are a number of circumstances in which an entity might put its own meter back to back with the utility meter, and so obtain that information. But I don't think it's unreasonable for a QF to want an understanding of the granularity with which what it's being paid is calculated.
Thank you. And just to conclude on this matter, I think you said you observed that the administrative charge, or the increase in the administrative charge, outstripped the consumer price index, and that if you had calculated the increase according to the CPI, the charge would actually be $14.23 per month instead of $22.82. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd like to just find the area in my report where we quoted the those exact figures, but subject to check. That's correct.
Well, it's page 18, the bottom paragraph, if you need to check it. But nonetheless, you concluded that the increase in the administrative charge was reasonable? Or did you?
So we did not cover it in our concluding remarks. And I think our objective in pulling together the report and pulling together our opinion is to determine which things to highlight and which things we feel are worthy of observation without rising to the level of a major conclusion. So we looked at this, and I understand that materiality is often in the eye of the beholder. We made the observations that we made. We also followed up in responses to interrogatories. We ultimately decided, partially based on the settlement, that this was not an area that we would include in the major conclusions, although we did draw it out in the report. Does it fall outside of our plus minus 10%? Mm-hmm. Yes, if we look at it in isolation. But if we look at it in conjunction with the other charges, then our view was that it was not material.
The other charges being Dominion's charges?
No. Thank you for allowing me to be more precise. The proposed avoided energy, avoided capacity, SISC charges.
Well, and I want to thank you for bringing it up, because honestly, we didn't talk about this charge at all in the last hearing, and it's significant. And if you highlighted it but didn't make a finding to it, which is what I understand you saying, that's fine. I just wanted to be clear on whether you did or did not make a finding of reasonableness on this on this increase.
No, we had recommended transparency, but we did not make a finding in our conclusions.
Okay, thank you for that. Do you know Zachary Ming?
I have never met him.
Y'all have are you familiar with the firm E3?
Yes.
E3, would you agree, is a reputable consulting firm?
Yes.
Did you have an opportunity to review Mr. Ming's resume attached to his testimony?
Yes.
And y'all have a lot in common, right? He teaches at Stanford and you teach at Columbia, is that right?
That's correct.
And he's worked in Canada, and you've worked in Canada, but I think in different provinces. He was in Nova Scotia. Where were you? Alberta, maybe?
I've also worked in Nova Scotia. I've worked in several provinces in addition to Alberta and Ontario.
You have an extensive resume. Do you have any reason to discredit Mr. Ming's qualifications to give his report?
No. People with extensive qualifications may disagree from time to time on particular elements regarding regulatory economics, but I have no reason based on his CV to doubt his credentials or the depth of his understanding.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your examination of the marginal energy calculations. On page 25 of your report, you explained, and I think you've alluded to it already, that you used the Energy Information Administration's AEO retrospective review to arrive at what you call a zone of reasonableness for price forecasts. Is that right?
Yes.
And the idea is that you look at how far off previous projections of prices were, and you observe the error, and then you apply that error rate prospectively to what's been presented to you by Duke Energy and the ORS. Do I have that right?
Yes, I think I might state it slightly differently in that we do our own analysis, and we then compare our analysis to the results that are presented by the applicants.
Mm-hmm.
And we look to see in a plus minus fashion whether what we come up with is within that zone of reasonableness of plus minus 10%.
You said it much better than I did. The price forecasting error, that's the measure of the errors that were made looking retrospectively at the price index, at prices, previous forecasts. Do I have that right?
Yes.
And you take the average price forecasting error over 10 years to arrive at your zone of reasonableness.
Yes, that's correct.
And the 10-year average, coincidentally, of the PFE was 10%, correct?
Yes.
The 2-year PFE was 6%, though.
Yes, that's correct.
And are you aware the Commission holds avoided cost proceedings every 2 years?
Yes, I am.
And you replicated Duke's assumptions using your proprietary simulation model called PoolMod. You mentioned it earlier.
Yes.
And overall, PoolMod modeling found that the results were 7.5% higher than the results from DEC's Encompass modeling for 2-year fixed rates, 4.9% higher than DEC's results for 5-year rates, and 5.9% higher than DEC's results for 10-year rates. I think you reported that on page 28. Did I get those increases right?
Yes.
And because those increases fell, the comparison between PoolMod and Encompass, the differences were within the 10% zone of reasonableness. You found these increases or these calculations acceptable, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you model Dr. Ming's calculations in a similar way using PoolMod?
No, we did not.
Wouldn't that have been useful for this commission to know?
So our approach has always been to test the applicants and to come to our conclusions based on a comparison of our work to the applicant's work. We believe that that is consistent with our scope, and also provides the best independent view of whether the calculations are reasonable. That doesn't mean that we ignore the submissions from other parties. In fact, I believe that we summarize those and our differences in the report. But when I think about the way in which we look at price forecasts, there's always a degree of triangulation, right? Duke ran their model, ORS's consultant did their work, we did our work. We think that the best approach isn't for us to try to replicate both the applicant's methodology and another intervener's methodology. Rather, it's to go out, do our own analysis, see whether that indicates consistency with the applicant's views, and then to go and review what others have submitted and come to a view based on our own modeling as to what we agree with and what we disagree with. So that's our process.
So to put a fine point on it, you did not use pool mod to model Dr. Ming's or Mr. Ming's calculations.
We didn't, because we don't believe that that was necessary for us to come to a valid conclusion in our report.
Okay. Let's talk about avoided capacity costs, because you modeled Duke's avoided capacity costs, but you did not model Mr. Ming's avoided capacity costs.
That's correct.
And Mr. Ming's avoided capacity costs were actually higher than Duke's avoided capacity costs, were they not?
Yes, he had some countervailing estimates as well, but ultimately that's correct.
In fact, they were roughly twice Duke's avoided capacity costs. Well, no, not the costs, in fairness. Mr. Ming used a fixed operating and maintenance cost using the EIA's publicly available cost estimate instead of the proprietary Burns and McDonnell estimate, which I think you did as well. Am I right about that?
Correct, yes.
But Mr. Ming found a fixed operation and maintenance cost of $7.33 per kilowatt per year, whereas Duke found a fixed operation and maintenance cost of $3.50 per kilowatt per year. Is that right?
Yes.
And the difference between that was Mr. Ming did not use Duke's adjustment for, quote, economies of scale, while Duke did, and I believe you did as well.
Just to clarify, is your question whether we used the economies of scale?
You accepted it, didn't you?
Yes, we in fact looked at a variety of scenarios with and without the 4-unit adjustment.
And your conclusion was that you weren't opposed to the economies of scale adjustment because, quote, and you can turn to page 41, it aligns with the company's approach in determining the capital cost estimate. Is that correct?
Yes, that is a direct quote.
That's your position?
So I want to make sure that I understand the question. Is your question, is it appropriate to use an economies of scale adjustment when calculating the avoided capacity costs?
My question was, did you find it appropriate to use an economies of scale adjustment when using the when calculating avoided capacity costs?
So our report says LEI is not opposed to making the economies of scale adjustment to the fixed O&M cost estimate, as this aligns with the company's approach in determining the capital cost estimate. So I think, and I apologize if I'm not following your question, but I think we've been clear that we're not opposed to making the economies of scale adjustment in the fixed O&M cost estimate.
Right, but I want to be clear that the reason you gave for it was it aligns with the company's approach in determining capital costs. Is that the reason for it?
So I think it's important to get back to the question of avoided costs. And the avoided cost calculation, I don't want to call it a straitjacket, but it puts certain boundaries on the way in which we think about things. And if the company, let's just speak broadly here, but let's imagine that the company has a series of sites. They incorporate some infrastructure, they incorporate some land, and all of these things make it cheaper for the company to add a new unit. We are talking about the company's avoided costs. And as such, it becomes more challenging if you say, yeah, you know what, I think that we should think about a single unit in isolation somewhere where we have to build new infrastructure and we have to do a whole host of other things. That calculation, I would argue, is only appropriate if the company has run out of sites and doesn't have the optionality to add in a fashion that provides for economies of scale. Now, effectively, the company, in doing its calculations, is representing that it does have those opportunities. Now, we're not in a position, nor do I think it would be appropriate, for us to go and assess every land holding that the company has, to look at every current generating unit and determining whether that degree of optionality exists. But at the same time, right, presuming that it does, we can't say that an avoided cost exists where it doesn't. And so incorporating economies of scale, presuming those are calculated, presuming that those are reasonable, seems to me to be an appropriate approach to looking at the avoided cost of capacity.
The economy of scale that Mr. Snyder articulated in his testimony was building 3 units at a time. That's what I recall. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. So if Duke says it can achieve economies of scale by building 3 units, then that's the measure you defer to, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Professor, you've been very patient with me. I have a final question for you. On page 20 and 21 of your report, when you talk about Converse Energy, you quote Mr. Lamb, and you say, Mr. Lamb contends that DEC's proposed rate, in brackets, of 4.59 cents per kilowatt hour, which requires a 10-year contract commitment, is insufficient to justify the investments needed to operating the Clifton Dam No. 3 power station. Did I quote that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. I hope we in turn quoted correctly.
I think you did.
Okay.
Do you have any reason to dispute Mr. Lamb's statement?
No.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Trini. ORS,
No questions.
thank you. Commissioners, questions for Mr. Goulding? Commissioner Thomas?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Goulding.
Good morning.
I just have a few questions. So, in connection with the SISC, how does that relate to, or does it relate to the VIC charge?
So broadly, our understanding is that they're intended to address similar challenges, that the uncertainty surrounding production from solar facilities causes costs to the system that are unique to those facilities and therefore are charged to those facilities.
All right, but they're very, very similar, the concept. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so would this apply to the hydro facility? I mean, would they be charged the SISC or the VIC, depending on which situation we're talking about?
So my understanding from the record is that practically speaking, they are not charged an integration charge, that the integration charge is at least in South Carolina, primarily charged to solar facilities.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Commissioner Caston?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Mr. Goodwin.
Good morning.
You referenced, I guess, a study the Bridal Group did, and looking at, I guess, exploration of potential electricity market reforms and such. And, you know, I don't have an opinion one way or the other, but do you have, or have you seen any empirical evidence that an RTO saves or have saved customers money?
Chair Belzer, respectfully, the question solicits information that we had objected to and moved to strike. I'd like to preserve our objection.
Your objection is preserved, subject
you.
to your objection.
Thank you. So, yes, I have seen studies that RTOs provide savings to customers. Many of the existing RTOs periodically publish those findings. And in particular, there are periodic reports from the California EIM. I shouldn't really call it California EIM. It's a mechanism that operates across the Western states, depending on the members, that discuss the benefits of integration. Now, granted, those benefits are going to vary across service territories, across geographies, but those types of studies do exist.
Well, I think you answered it, but let me ask it another way because are you aware of any studies that, I guess, look at the detail, and when it's all said and done, that there's verifiable, sustainable evidence that a system such as that has physically reduced or actually reduced the cost or the rates to the customer of those with that additional entity?
So, and I apologize if I'm not getting at the heart of your question. The studies that I have seen provided quantitative analysis of savings. Now, the challenge with any of these studies is that
Excuse me 1 second. Did you say qualitative or quantitative?
Quantitative. I apologize for not speaking clearly. Quantitative. So they had real numbers associated with them. But the challenge of doing any of these studies, right, is that you have to come up with a counterfactual, right? And those counterfactuals are also based on modeling, and as we've noted here, there is certainly fallacies of misplaced precision that go into some of these numbers, right? So there's a range of uncertainty around them. And so the what if analysis, if the RTO didn't exist and things had gone on without it, what would the costs have been? That is, effectively your baseline against which you're judging the costs that were actually incurred. And so with any of these studies, you need to review what the assumptions are, how they would have flowed down to the customer bill, because all of these are at the wholesale level. So it is important to do a detailed analysis of what the studies actually say, and in particular to look at the what if side, because that's what's establishing the delta between what people think would have happened and the benefits that the RTO brought.
Okay, I think I followed all that, but all that said, it sounds like what you're saying is there's a lot of assumptions, but I didn't hear the term definitive. So is it fair for me to say, well, it's not definitive, but it would require a deeper dive?
I think that's fair. If I were studying for a particular jurisdiction, you need to establish the baseline, and you need to then look at what you expect the alternative outcomes to be, and your assumptions, your inputs, they all have to be specific to the jurisdiction. It also depends on the size of the expanse, if you will, of the wholesale market being created. And so the smaller the territory, the less the benefits of integration are likely to be, because you're going to have less diversification of resources and geography.
All righty, thank you. And you do understand relative to all this discussion and questions that that is not currently anything related to South Carolina law.
Yes.
Okay. Finally, looking at page 52 on your concluding remarks, where you talk about, excuse me, avoided capacity cost, LAI relying solely on publicly available data. And you state the analysis highlights the need for transparency and the underlying assumptions relied on by the companies. And did the companies provide all the info that you or LEI requested?
I think we don't have an issue with how the companies responded to interrogatories, and we also appreciated the additional information from the rebuttal testimony that was provided.
Okay. That's all I had, Mr. Goulden. Appreciate you showing up this morning. Well, showing up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any further questions for this witness?
Chair Belzer, this is Commissioner Williams.
Commissioner Williams, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Golding.
Good morning.
You just taught me a new word. Did I hear you say the word counterfactuals?
I may have said that word, yes.
Okay. Is that just the idea that there are always going to be alternative opinions based on facts?
If I may, I might state it a little bit differently.
Okay.
Which is one of the challenges of regulatory economics or electricity market design is that we can't run a controlled experiment, right? We can't say, okay, we're going to have two different timelines, one in which we have traditional regulation, one in which we have a wholesale market, and we're going to observe these in the laboratory, and we're going to come to our conclusions accordingly. What we have is the messiness of real life, and we have an understanding of sort of the practical ways in which a wholesale market might reduce costs. And we have an understanding of how the system might evolve under traditional regulation. And so the counterfactual is whatever you're not doing. Right? If you're doing traditional regulation, then the counterfactual is what would the world have looked like if you had had a wholesale market. And then conversely, let's say we're talking about, I don't know, the state of New York, right? You'd say, well, what would have happened in New York if we had continued with traditional regulation? Now, the fact that we can't run a controlled experiment doesn't necessarily mean that we've got several different opinions of, I would argue, equal validity, right? We can look at the data, we can think about how this data might evolve, and I think we can understand the key assumptions that make a difference. And if you don't mind, I'll give some examples, right? So if you believe that a traditional regulatory environment reduces the overall cost of capital for the industry and allows for efficiency from planning, right? You might convert those into certain financial benefits to final consumers, right? And you might want to compare those against the costs of setting up a wholesale market, right? And managing that wholesale market. And then you'd say, okay, notwithstanding those costs of setting up the wholesale market and the potential change in the cost of capital for generation, what does this look like, right? And there are circumstances under which you might come to the conclusion, hey, traditional regulation actually produces lower costs for consumers, right? There are other conditions where you'd say, oh, over the long run, greater regional integration lowers cost to consumers. Now, we need to be clear that if, let's say, natural gas costs are rising, right? Costs to consumers are going to rise under either model. The difference is going to potentially be in terms of timing, and arguably that a larger geographic area provides you opportunities to use more efficient resources more frequently. But when you're developing your counterfactual, you need to explain how you took into account each of those variables. And so, at least from my perspective, I would like to see that kind of analysis before I came to any final conclusions about what's best for any particular jurisdiction.
Thank you. It's always good when my world is a little bit bigger after listening and following up on some of the curiosities. In the previous hearing, I asked you a question about the 10-year time frame for avoided cost and whether that was looked at this assessment. I'd just like to get your thoughts on the record here.
Certainly. So the 10-year time frame has advantages and disadvantages depending on your perspective, right? And let's take the customer's perspective here, right? If you expect that costs are going to be rising throughout the forecast horizon, right, then as a customer, you may be attracted to the idea of locking in for longer. And so from that perspective, again, speaking from the customer's viewpoint, you might say, hey, I might want more than 10 years. Right? I might like that 40-year fixed mortgage. Just being hypothetical, I'm not suggesting that you go for a 40-year contract. Obviously, the flip side is that there's risk to customers that you're locked in for a long period of time, and that costs fall. So, the experience of the 1980s is that the initial PURPA contracts didn't really anticipate how costs were going to change in the industry. And so they were all done under the assumption, sometimes baked into the contracts, that oil prices would rise forever, that the marginal unit might be a large oil-fired unit, and that was how avoided costs were calculated. That turned out to be quite wrong, well within the 20-year time frame. So the flip side of this is when we take the developer perspective, right? They're building 20 or 30-year assets. Some solar assets we're now seeing are expected to operate for 35 years. And they need bankability, which means they need to be able to go to the bank and say, look, I have a clear line of sight as to what my revenues are going to be throughout the life of my asset, or at least throughout the life of my loan. And most lenders are conservative. They will discount revenues that aren't linked to some kind of a fixed price contract. And usually they'll amortize probably at least a year less. So if you have a 10-year contract, they'll give you a loan for 9 years that you have to pay back, in full by the end of that 9 years. So having a longer term lowers the costs to the developer and means that, all things being equal, you will get more participation, more development with a longer term contract, depending on the price, right? You're not going to get more development if you've got a 20-year contract at half the price that you'd have with a 10-year contract, right? So 10 years, I suspect the developer community would be likely to prefer having a longer term option available to them because it makes it easier for them to obtain financing depending on the pricing. The customer's position is more difficult, right? And it's made more difficult by the developments of the past 2 years. Because historically, we've seen costs for solar and battery technologies in particular fall dramatically, which suggests that as a customer, you might not want to be locked in for a long period of time because you'd want to take advantage of even lower costs that are coming down the pike, presuming that you can firm them. Right, so I'm talking about solar plus battery or solar plus some other resource from a reliability perspective. But the past 2 years, we've seen supply chain challenges. We've seen volatility, which in and of itself is hedgeable, but we've seen volatility in natural gas prices. Although that appears to have been worked out of the system, right? Natural gas prices are now lower than they were before the crisis in Ukraine began. So when we think about risk to the customer, when we think about long-term avoided costs, 10 years may be good for the customers in the sense that you aren't going to lock in because you believe that the costs at the end of the 10 years are going to be lower than the contracts that you're entering into now. I'm not convinced of the lower forever narrative around solar plus storage. But on the other hand, timing the markets is always a challenge. And PURPA is a challenging tool with regards to building new resources. If you want to reveal what the cost of new resources are, then you go for a competitive procurement. And that will really tell you, do people prefer a 10-year contract to a 20-year contract? You have much more price discovery in that than you do under PURPA, where you're trying to back into what you think the utilities costs are going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, et cetera. So from a regulatory perspective, my preference is almost always for some kind of a competitive procurement process rather than what is essentially a feed-in tariff, which is how PURPA manifests itself. Oh, sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but I hope it was helpful.
It was, and of course you had some background knowledge that you might get that question again based on the other docket that's related. My final question is, do you know of a hydro-related rate in North Carolina or an avoided cost rate for hydro in North Carolina?
I don't have it in front of me right now.
Okay. Thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you.
Commissioners, further questions for this witness? Mr. Goulding, thank you for your appearance this morning and for your report. Anything further? We appreciate the work you've done and you sharing your information with us. And with that, you may stand down.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let's take a 10-minute break before we begin with the next witnesses. If we would. We'll be back at, 14 minutes, 11:30 by Verizon time. Good morning and welcome back to the Public Service Commission as we continue in this morning's proceeding involving dockets numbers 2023-16E and 2023-17E, which pertains to Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress's 2023 avoided cost proceeding. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Carolee Williams. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Caston, and Commissioner Belser. Duke.
Madam Chair, as the applicant in this proceeding, since we're in kind of a rebuttal mode as related to LEI's independent report of our avoided cost application, I would respectfully request that we go after Converse if that suits.
Any objection? Hearing none. Hearing none, we'll recognize Mr. Torini.
Mr. Lamb, if you'll raise your right hand, I'm going to swear you in. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Lamb.
Mr. Lamb, yes. Turn that microphone on, please. Thank you.
Good morning.
Did you prepare or cause to be prepared 4 pages of testimony in response to the report of London Economics International?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any corrections or changes you wish to make to that testimony?
No, no changes.
If I were to ask you the questions in the testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, I move to admit the pre-filed responsive testimony of Tim Lamb into the record, please.
Mr. Lamb's pre-filed rebuttal testimony in response to the report of London Economics International will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
Thank you. Mr. Lamb, did you prepare a summary of your testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you please give the commission your summary?
Good morning. I'm Tim Lamb, president of Converse Energy Incorporated, which owns and operates the Converse Dam Power Station number 3 in Spartanburg County, South Carolina. I'm here to respond to the report of London Economics International filed in this docket. I believe London Economics ignored the purpose of PURPA. Congress enacted PURPA in response to the energy crisis of the 70s to promote renewable energy and reduce our dependence on foreign oil. It is entirely consistent with PURPA's goals to preserve the viability of a small hydro facility like Converse and recognize its unique qualities. As the Commission is aware, avoided costs are made using a series of assumptions that can be questioned. In fact, even ORS's witness, Dr. Ming, questioned Duke's avoided cost calculations. But common sense should lead London Economics and this Commission to question Duke's assumptions and calculations. How can Duke's retail rates have increased 176% in 17 years, while its avoided cost rates have declined 15% over 38 years? Converse avoided cost rate in 1985 was 3.25 cents per kilowatt hour, and today's comparable rate is 2.77 cents per kilowatt hour. In 2009, Duke Energy Carolina's second revised LEAF 5-year avoided cost rate was 6.45 cents a kilowatt hour, or about 80% of the 2009 retail residential rate, which was about 8.032 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, DEC is proposing a 5-year rate of 4.59 cents per kilowatt hour, about 37% of its current retail residential rate. And Converse would have to sign a 10-year fixed rate PPA or contract to receive that rate. Common sense tells you that Duke is either over-earning or underpaying. London Economics also applied the wrong standard when it reviewed the stipulation between ORS and Duke. London Economics was engaged as an independent third-party consultant to submit independently derived conclusions as to the utilities calculations of avoided costs. South Carolina Code 584120. Instead, London Economics merely opined on whether the methodology used in the stipulation results in plausible outcomes, even though its own calculations resulted in higher avoided cost rates. London Economics did not address South Carolina law's specific authorization of avoided cost methodologies that account for differences in the resource type of small power providers. This is where small hydro's reliability comes in. On December 24th, 2022, during the winter storm Elliott, Converse Dam Power Station number 3 operated at a 62.8% capacity factor. I doubt solar QFs had a comparable output. Last year, Converse's output dropped substantially in any hour fewer than 10 times. This variation happens daily with the solar facility. So I'm again asking the Commission to develop a hydro-specific rate. However, because this cannot be done during this proceeding, the Commission should extend DEC's 2013 rate of 0.0558 per kilowatt hour as of the February 2023 to Converse and other small hydro QFs until the new rate can be developed. This concludes my testimony or summary.
Thank you, Mr. Lamb. Please answer any questions council or the commissioners may have.
Okay.
Office of Regulatory Staff?
No question.
Duke? No question. Commissioners, questions for Mr. Lamb? Commissioner Thomas?
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
So let me just ask a few questions, if you don't mind, about the your facility and operations, how it works. So it's a run-of-the-river hydro. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
So you basically, you take what comes and you generate power. You can't really have much control over. You can't dam up the river more and hold water till different times of the day. Is that correct?
Correct. By the FERC exemption from licensing that we have to operate run-of-river, meaning maintain the reservoir full, so whatever water's coming down the river is what we use to make power.
Okay. And so do you have people there 24/7? Is there somebody there at the facility all the time, or?
No, there's no way, even back in the beginning of the project in '85, that you could afford a full-time operator. It takes about 80 man-hours a week to operate the project, daily efforts to clean intakes, make sure machinery is running, and then that same crew maintains the site and does the major maintenance when we have larger maintenance issues. But that 80 man-hours a week is 2 people working 40 hours a week. We don't operate a man around the clock. We have automation that calls us if the plant goes offline.
Okay. And this is a little bit off the wall question, but could you combine with battery storage and sell power to the utility at a time frame when you could get a higher rate? I can't imagine that would make any sense, but I'm just...
My impression of battery storage, which is a fact right now, is it's still not economically feasible to put in enough batteries to store enough energy to offset. Well, again, we have to operate run-of-rivers, so we run the generators with whatever water we have. All of that energy goes into the Duke grid, so there's really nothing less to charge batteries. And the original rate structure was set that there were on-peak and off-peak periods of the day, 8 16 hours on peak and 8 hours off peak in the contract that just ended. You can't, no, I'm getting confused with storage for using the reservoir as a storage medium. In other words, run the project harder during the daytime, draw the reservoir down, and then let the reservoir fill back up at night. That violates the FERC run-of-river requirement. So even with battery storage, it would not accomplish anything.
Okay. But so if you were to sign one of these contracts, and so I'm looking at the 5-year interconnection to distribution, the rate that I see for winter morning hours is $6.80. That's under a 5-year. I mean, that is available to you, is it not?
Are you looking at $6.80?
This is
per meg-
this is on page 15 of the LEI report. You might not have that in front of you, but Mr. Torini referred to this, and I'm just trying to get a feel for what other options you have.
Okay, these numbers are in cents per kilowatt hour. So the new granular rate structure, which I've complained about, the last bill that we got 4 different rates during the month. There are groups of hours for each one of these rates. A hydro project running constant output, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you can time average those rates and come up with an average rate per kilowatt hour. The 5-year rate under that long-term contract comes out to be about 4.05 cents a kilowatt hour, a little over 4 cents a kilowatt hour. The contract that we just ended was 5.58 cents on an average annual rate. So it would be a rate reduction.
Right. But when you look at the detail hour by hour, you're basically getting paid at a higher rate during periods of time when theoretically your output is of more value to the utility, and you're getting paid at a higher rate than solar would get during a lot of hours. Is that correct?
Yes, anything outside of the daylight hours, we're being paid. So we get a rate for that, yes.
Okay.
Again, back to the consistency of 24/7 solar running. We have to use every bit of water we can to make the project work. So water over the dam is lost revenue. Because we run consistently that way, and river flows are essentially consistent. Yes, they vary somewhat month to month in rainstorms, but in a 24-hour period, river flow is very consistent. So if you just time average all of those rates for the number of hours for each of the rate bucket, it comes out to the 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's what that rate would mean to us.
All right. And you mentioned in your most recent testimony that that the outcome helps Duke. I mean, to me, the cost of the power that you sell to Duke is a flow through. It goes straight to the customer. So how does that help Duke?
Because Duke doesn't have to start and stop generators daily to compensate for the load that the project supplies. Every bit of our power goes to a customer at the time that we produce it and is billed to a customer. compared to solar, whatever the solar farm produces during the daylight time, the utility has to bring generators online at night to compensate for that load. Duke has to supply the customers 24 hours a day. We supply a group of customers constantly 24 hours a day with no interruption, essentially. And that's where during the 24th of last year, we were online running steady output at 60%, 62% of the capacity of the plant during their outages.
Okay. And there's been some talk about the SISC, and so does Converse pay that?
No, it is billed specifically to solar projects, and I question its accuracy because it is a minuscule charge. It's less than a penny a kilowatt hour to a solar project. To me, technically, the utility has to deal with a whole lot more problems to start up that generation as soon as the sun goes down and keep it running during the night, and then back it down and let it idle during the day. And again, anytime generation is not being used, generating power, it's lost capital investment. So we don't pay that solar integration charge. It is solely for solar projects.
Okay. Thank you. I believe that's all I have right now.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any further questions for Mr. Lamb? Good morning, Mr. Lamb. It's nice to see you again. Mr. Lamb, in your testimony, you've compared the increases in residential rates with decreases in avoided cost.
Correct.
Is that fair?
Correct.
Can you point me to where in PURPA comparisons to the retail rates factor into PURPA avoided cost?
I don't think PURPA specifically addresses that issue.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Anything further? Mr. Tarini, do you have any
Chair
reading?
Belser?
Oh, excuse me, Commissioner
I'm sorry.
Williams. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Lamb, I just have a few questions.
Okay. Good morning.
Good to see you today. Let me find them. I guess I'll just start with, I think we had discussion before about a hydro-specific rate in North Carolina. Can you tell me more about that? Do I remember that correctly?
Yes, there is a published, I think it's called PP1, published rate that has differential rate in North Carolina, approved by the North Carolina Utilities Commission, that has differential rates for specifically for hydroelectric projects.
And this is avoided cost?
Yes, it's a similar schedule. I have it in my folder. Let me just get it.
While you're looking for it, do you know how long it's been there?
Commissioner Williams, just a moment. He's getting his folder and he needs to get back to the microphone.
Yes, I believe this is the current, it's called C-1, Duke Energy Progress, LLC, North Carolina. And it went into effect November 1st, 2021. And I'm assuming.
Do you know how long it's been available? How long there has been?
No. I just looked up the current schedule PP. It's also called PP-9, Purchase Power Schedule PP-9. I didn't look up previous dockets to see how long it had been offered.
Okay. And then I heard you in your testimony ask us to look at for an alternative rate and understanding that that would need to be in a separate situation and that you would ask us to approve extending the Duke 2013 rate that had just in your prior contract. And my question to you is for you to think about what it's like to be us and how would that be just and reasonable and fair to all consumers?
My position is that the avoided cost rate structure is based on the solar resource. Almost all of the documentation we've had in this hearing is based on solar energy. For 20 years, there was no solar on the grid. Duke's renewable energy resources purchased from QFs was hydro. And during that time, those rates tracked somewhat along with retail rates. I mean, it's only logical that the difference between what Duke pays us for the energy and what they bill the customer for is a potential margin for them. They mark the energy that they purchase from us up and bill it to customers. So for 20 years or so, the avoided cost rates somewhat track retail rates. Since solar has come onto the grid, retail rates have dropped, or avoided cost rates have dropped drastically. And my argument to that is that these avoided cost rates are oriented towards the solar renewable resource, not hydro, as was the case for the first 20 years that we operated the project from 1985. So any rate reduction right now for a hydro project disagrees with what went on for the first 20 years, just plain market business-wise. So our argument is that the 5.58 cents that we got levelized rate for the previous previous 10 years prior to February 7th, was somewhat reasonable to retail rates. Any reduction right now just does not make common sense to retail energy rates increasing as much as they have. And that's why, without getting into the weeds of how avoided costs are calculated, I believe the current rates are based on a solar project, which only operates during daylight hours, versus the baseload type of operation that a hydro project operates at. And I understand our substantiation to asking for the previous rate that we had gotten for 10 years is in line with what's gone on for a hydro project since then. And I believe if a hydro rate is offered specifically designed and accounting for the reliability of a hydroelectric project is created, that would even be an increase to the 5.58 cents. So the rationalization is we're asking to go back to the rate that was in effect until a hydro rate can be approved by the commission.
Thank you. I guess my final question really is to give you a chance to say anything else that you would like to say about the CISC, because as I listen to you, while I may have a lot of sympathy, it seems to me the CISC is where not having to pay the CISC is where you should have relief. And I heard your answers to Commissioner Thomas, and I don't have a specific question, but if you had any further thoughts after answering his question, I would love to hear them.
And you said in the beginning something about my comments on relief. Did I misunderstand you, or?
you know, the way I understand it in listening to the various parties, avoided cost, should be the avoided cost, and that you, by not having to pay the CISC, that is the kernel of where your relief should be.
I understand. I understand.
And
Yes.
so the prior conversation was about how, it's such a small amount that it almost it sounds like, from your perspective, the base avoided cost is too low, and the CISC, from your perspective, is also too low. Not that you have done the analysis that LEI has done or that Duke has done. So I'm really just giving you a chance. If there's anything else you wanted to say following your conversation with Commissioner Thomas regarding the role that the relief is what I said of not having to pay the CISC. If there's anything else you want to say in that regard, I am ready to listen.
I understand now, and I appreciate the opportunity. To me, the solar integration charge should be greater than it is because of the variability of a solar project, not running 24 hours a day, only running during daylight hours, and requiring the utility to provide backup generation for the solar output when the sun goes down. The number is minuscule. It's less than 1 penny a kilowatt hour. So yes, in effect, the fact that a hydro project right now does not have to pay that is a kicker for a hydro project. You might say, I think that was part of your question, or a benefit. I don't think the variation just due to that solar integration charge is enough to compensate for the 24/7 benefit of a hydroelectric project that essentially has been included in rates prior to solar coming onto the grid. Did that?
And as part of your analysis, did you look at what is in the CISC?
I just look at it as a fact that it's a charge or a rate reduction that
Right.
we don't have to pay. And,
Right.
And again, 1/10 of a cent, or I think it's 3/10 of a cent or something, is pretty small compared to a 4 or 5 cent overall rate per kilowatt hour. Again, our things went along for 20 or 30 years with rates that were somewhat reasonable. Any business that has had to receive the same weight or rate per widget, rate per kilowatt hour for the last 10 years is going to suffer. Duke hasn't been forced to take the same rate that they got 10 years ago. Now, again, there's a lot of things involved in that charge, but my position is that the avoided cost calculations, due to assumptions and methodologies, are based more on solar than a 24-hour hydroelectric project.
Mr. Lamb, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Right. Thank you.
Anything further for Commissioner Thomas? Your light is on. Do you have more questions?
I have one follow-up.
All right, sir.
Okay.
So I think I heard you say that Duke marks up the power that they purchase from you or anybody else. Did I understand you correctly on that?
Exactly. In the area where we are, our customers are residential customers. We're a small enough project that we don't go to with large industrial customers for different types of rates. So I base my testimony on what the average retail rate is, and right now it's a little over 12 cents a kilowatt hour for anything over 1,000 kilowatt hours in a month. So right now, Duke is paying us on average, because we're on this variable rate, 2.77 cents a kilowatt hour. That energy instantly, the way electricity works, instantly goes to a customer's meter supplies their load, and that customer is billed 12.4589 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's a 300 or 400% markup.
Okay, but I guess my point is that what Duke pays for energy or fuel is a direct flow through. It's not like they get to mark it up a certain percentage. It's a matter of what they're paying is a direct flow through to the customer. That's you know, it's just
Right.
probably a minor technical point, but it's you know, slight difference, I guess, is my point.
Right. Again, just from just simple economics, we produce the power. Duke pays us 2.7 cents, and it's billed to a customer instantly at the retail rate or a retail rate. And yes, in their rate structures, there are fuel charges and all that are used to set that retail rate. But to us, it's the avoided cost rate is what we are paid for.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas. Anything further for Mr. Lamb? Mr. Torini, any redirect?
No, but in response to Commissioner Williams, I would ask the Commission to take judicial notice of North Carolina's avoided cost proceedings in 2021. That would be docket number E100-sub-175, in which the North Carolina Utilities Commission approved a 2.0 performance adjustment factor.
Respectfully, Madam Chair, I would object. It's well outside of the scope of not only the proceeding, but this hearing, which is focused on LEI's report on the company's avoided cost methodology.
Madam Chair, this same information was admitted into the record over Duke's objection in the hearing we had before.
If it's in the record, Madam Chair, then it's in the record.
That's what, is it in the record already?
The performance adjustment factor was in the record. I'm just giving a citation to it in case Commissioner Williams would like to see it. If Duke doesn't want her to see it, I don't really understand why.
Is there a specific statute in North Carolina that allows for the separate hydro?
Not to my knowledge.
I'm not sure,
Okay.
Madam Chair, but we can brief that if helpful.
No, that's okay. I'm going to allow the judicial notice of the performance adjustment factor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Lamb, that's all today. Thank you very much for appearing. Mr. Welborn, or
Madam Chair, we're going to call Glenn Snyder to the stand, please.
and he's virtual.
Yes.
Good morning, Chair Belser. Can you hear me okay?
Good morning, Mr. Snyder. Yes, we can. And Mr. Marco, I'll go ahead and swear the witness before you begin.
Please
Mr.
do.
Snyder, would you raise your right hand, please? Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Marco?
Good morning, Mr. Snyder. Did you prepare or cause to be prepared 9 pages of rebuttal testimony responding to the report of London Economics International?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any changes to your rebuttal testimony at this time?
No, I do not.
If I were to ask you the same questions today that were asked in your pre-filed rebuttal testimony, would your answers remain the same?
Yes, they would.
So, Chair Belser, I would ask that Mr. Snyder's pre-filed rebuttal testimony responding to the London Economics report be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Snyder's rebuttal testimony responding to the London Economics International report will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Mr. Snyder, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared 1 confidentially filed exhibit that was attached to your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any changes to that exhibit at this time?
No, I do not.
Chair Belzer, I would ask that Mr. Snyder's confidentially filed rebuttal exhibit be entered as the next hearing exhibit and that it remain under seal.
Mr. Snyder's exhibit attached to his pre-filed rebuttal LEI testimony will be marked for identification as hearing exhibit 11, admitted into the evidence of this case, and will be maintained under seal. And I don't think we have a commission order holding this because it came in after our business meeting, so we will grant confidential treatment to the exhibit and keep it under seal.
Appreciate that, Chair Belzer.
Thank you.
Mr. Snyder, did you prepare a summary of your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you please present it for the commission?
Yes. Chair Belzer, Commission, thank you for having me this morning. I have a short summary of my rebuttal testimony. The purpose of my rebuttal testimony is to respond to certain portions of London Economic International's independent report on Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress's 2023 avoided cost proceeding, the report as amended on September 22nd, 2023. My rebuttal testimony first highlights that LEI generally supported the company's 2023 avoided cost filing. In particular, the report indicates that it supports all aspects of the proposed stipulation between the companies and the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff. With respect to the company's proposed avoided capacity costs, however, LEI requested that the companies provide further clarification and support for the 36.5% inflation rate assumed by the companies to escalate the EIA cost estimates from $2021 to $2023. The companies appreciate the opportunity to further explain their methodology for determining appropriate inflation rates for use in calculating their avoided capacity rates, and my rebuttal testimony provides the additional information requested. Specifically, my testimony explains that the company used data from Burns & McDonnell to develop a technology-specific inflation rate for the 2021 through 2023 time period. Burns & McDonnell is a globally recognized engineering design firm, and its project cost data is compiled based on actual industry-specific bids in the marketplace. The companies derived a 36.5% inflation rate by comparing the Burns & McDonnell capital cost estimate for a 7F frame CT from 2021 relative to the estimate for 2023. My Snyder rebuttal LEI confidential exhibit 1 shows the company's calculation of this technology-specific inflation rate. In contrast, LEI identified a lower inflation rate from 21 to 23 using a more general Bureau of Economic Analysis gross domestic product price index, which measures changes in prices paid for goods and services produced in the United States. Because the company's data is based on actual energy market specific cost to construct a CT, this data accounts for both the high inflation and supply chain constraints the construction industry has been experienced since 2021 in the Carolinas. For this reason, the companies believe that use of the Burns & McDonnell data more appropriately escalates the EIA capacity costs for the period 21 to 2023 than the general gross domestic product inflator used by LEI. Finally, my rebuttal testimony notes that LEI did not agree with Converse Energy witness Tim Lamb's recommendation that a hydro-specific rate should be adopted in South Carolina. The companies understand Converse's situation. While it has recovered revenues from customers for a number of years under historic avoided cost rate, it must now make a business decision as to whether to continue selling its power under updated, accurate avoided cost rates. It would be inconsistent with FERC Order number 872 or PURPA to subsidize Converse by paying a special hydro rate that exceeds the utility's avoided costs. This concludes the presentation of my testimony.
Mr. Torini, any questions?
No questions for this witness.
Mr. Mustin, I think y'all have agreed not to cross.
Correct, no question.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions for this witness? Mr. Snyder, I have a cup. Go ahead, Commissioner Williams.
Okay, sorry I'm slow on the draw today. Good to see you, Mr. Snyder.
Good to see you, Commissioner Williams.
I have one question about the Burns and McDonald information. You noted on page 6, but you don't need to turn there, that the combustion turbine project costs were related to the Carolinas. And my question is just whether Burns and McDonald is that detailed that it was Carolina related. You know, what was it that specific in terms of project costs that it was more relevant to our area than if it were just U.S. data?
Yes, they do, as I understand it, construct globally actually, but they have regional adjusters for labor costs and things of that nature. So they are able to take their information and make it specific to the region is my understanding, Commissioner Williams.
So from your understanding, it's labor costs, not the cost of getting materials in South Carolina versus Wyoming.
Right. And there may be transportation differences from where they're constructed, but the materials themselves are generally from the same set of supply chain manufacturers.
That makes some sense. Okay. Are you seeing any relief in supply chain?
Boy, it's going to be a big issue for the industry here, Commissioner Williams, in terms of how long both inflation and supply chain constraints last and when they abate. We did see pretty significant tick up in the last couple of years, to the best of our knowledge, but it is our hope that it starts to abate in the coming months and years. But no huge changes that we've seen at the moment.
Does supply chain issues always drive the cost up, or is that driving of the cost up related to the time to wait?
I think it's, multiple factors. We've seen in the news lately, labor costs, labor market is very tight. I was reading an article talking about how demand for turbines is resumed after a period of being down. I don't have a specific quote on that. It's just general knowledge, but that is, the demand goes up, labor costs are up, and you have trying to catch up on the supply side.
And that drives the cost up, all of that.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you in a position to talk to us about the hydro rate in North Carolina? And perhaps you did when we were having this discussion earlier in the hearing.
Yeah, I think we talked briefly about it the last time I was down. And again, I don't have the full history on that. As there is a long, hydro was the original QF, as pointed out in this proceeding, before solar came on. So, the legislative intent in both states I cannot speak to back then, but there is a historic rate that gets updated every couple of years. And I think the one difference in that North Carolina rate was or one of the differences was that the PAF that we spoke about, but I'm not familiar with the origination of that and how that made it into the original rate that's been just renewed every couple of years on that PAF in North Carolina.
Is there a CISC in North Carolina?
There is, and it does not apply. It's only to solar, as we spoke about in this. It does not apply to hydro.
And how does the avoided cost rate that's currently either being considered or adopted in North Carolina relate to what you are requesting in South Carolina?
The avoided costs, we file them at different points in time, but we use the peaker methodology in both states, the same models, the same approach in both states. So, you know, when you have changes in peaking with the cost of the peaker, which is the combustion turbine that changes over time, and natural gas costs change over time, you will get different rates when you calculate using the same methodology at different points in time, but they're very much calculated using the peaker method in both states.
And what's the North Carolina avoided cost, the most current North Carolina avoided cost right now?
Well, there's a series of 9 energy prices that we spoke about. So the time buckets, so there's not a rate that you can compare it to. We are getting ready to file updated North Carolina avoided cost rates this November. So coming up here very shortly. And so we will, you know, by and large, I would expect, unless there's been significant changes in gas price, which I don't think there have been, we should get relatively similar rates.
Okay, that's really what I'm driving at. And forgive me if I've already asked this, is the CISC rate similar in North Carolina?
Yes, we use the same study to support the SISC.
Would you address Mr. Lamb's question from the perspective that he's talking about the relationship of retail rates having increased 176% and avoided cost rates having declined by 15% over 38 years? I think we've heard that perhaps from Mr. Goulding's perspective, but I think it would be good for us to have that testimony from you.
Yeah, you know, there are two very different calculations. One is a historic looking cost of service that is across all parts of the business. So, you know, that's average rates, as you know, and y'all have been through many rate cases. And so they include all the costs that a customer incurs, as opposed to an avoided cost rate, which is a forward-looking marginal cost of new generation and associated O&M and other avoidable costs under PURPA. So that they don't include storm costs. They don't include, for example, generation costs from existing generation, you know, that are not avoidable. So labor costs to run the nuclear fleet, for example, are not in an avoided cost rate, but they are in base rates. So there's just many different factors that go into system average rates that are not part and parcel to an avoided cost rate. So, you know, if we have a hurricane and half the system gets knocked over and we have to rebuild it, that goes into base rates, but you wouldn't put that into a QF avoided cost rate as maybe as an extreme example. So they're just very, very different calculations, and you wouldn't expect them to have the same relationship.
And so to follow up on his point, what I think I hear you saying is that those costs that are in base rates have just dramatically increased over these 38 years.
Yeah, I think, you know, we're still within the industry. We are below average on national rates. So this is an industry trend that has happened across the country over 40 years. You know, as your system expands and you build new transmission and distribution, as you have labor costs that over 4 decades are going to change, you know, you're going to have a difference in your base rates. Gas costs, for example, used to be, 20 years ago, double what they are. There's a period in time where, we thought gas was going to be $8 or $9 an MMBTU forever. And now, gas costs have retreated with the occasional, notwithstanding the little spike we had a year ago. So there's another example of just where, things have changed, dramatically over time. And so PURPA is a forward-looking, but for the QF, what marginal cost would otherwise be occurred, as opposed to a historical total system cost that goes into a base rate calculation.
And in that case, his testimony is that there's a 15% decline in avoided cost over that time frame. What are some of the factors there?
Yeah, if you think about, as we were talking about and I think Mr. Golding brought it up as well, what we thought the marginal generators were going to be historically, and what we thought of fuel prices, was it going to be oil, and oil was going to go up, and it was going to be a marginal oil unit. And then as you move forward in time, it was going to be a marginal gas unit, but gas was going to be really expensive. And now, you have a marginal gas unit that's far more efficient than they were, 20, 30 years ago. And the commodity itself is far less expensive than what it was, 20 years ago. So the underlying efficiency of these units have improved dramatically over time. The fuel that they burn has gotten cheaper over time. And so you see a forward-looking avoided cost that is declined in relation to that, those efficiencies that the marketplace has seen.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Lamb cited the South Carolina law that talks about this, the commission's ability to consider geographic location and resource type of a small power producer in its defining of avoided cost. Does Duke look at and consider geographic locations when it thinks about avoided cost? Does it look at the resource type when it evaluates every 2 years?
Yes, I mean, I think there was some discussion earlier today about a distribution provider, QF, getting a higher value for avoiding transmission line losses that a transmission connected customer does not get. So there's a locational difference where if you're a transmission, you'll get a little bit lower rate paid to you than a distribution customer who avoids those transmission losses. So from the standpoint of specific rate, technology specific, Mr. Golding also spoke about, if you think about the history of our avoided cost rates, they used to only have 2 or 3, depending on the season, time buckets for the whole year. By going to more granular seasons and then hourly rate differentials within the season, and then capacity specific rates that are when capacity has the most value, in essence, you've created a rate structure that pays QFs appropriately, different QFs, by the value they create. So, for example, hydro that's producing the winter morning hour, I think there was a question earlier from Commissioner Thomas that it's going to be able to get that higher rate, that over 6 cents a kilowatt hour rate in the 5-year rate for producing. Solar won't be online. Those are dark hours, so they would not get the rate. Solar adds a battery to their project. They could put that solar in the battery, dispatch it, and get the rate. So depending on the QF type, you're going to be paid differently based on these time differentiated rates. So in essence, you have one rate structure that is available to all QFs, but each QF is going to receive a different payment, even if they produce the same number of kilowatt hours, based on their ability to provide that energy when it has the most value for customers.
I said that was final, but I see another question. And this relates to the monthly administrative cost, going from 11.07 to 22.9. And I didn't write whether that was deck or deck, and the other one going from $8.05 to $29.66 a month. Could you talk some about that administrative
Yeah, that,
change?
I think that was Mr. Johnson's testimony a little bit, Commissioner Williams. I will just point out maybe on that, the materiality question here, even with our small hydro QF. So it had not been changed in a number of years. If I recall, Mr. Johnson said the update was to reflect that fact that it had not changed for a number of years, the $11 a month going to 22. But, my end of the testimony is more on the energy and capacity calculations. And just from I was thinking through the materiality issue that, as it was discussed earlier, when even a small QF making the $45 rate would be for, that Mr. Lamb brought up would be, I don't know, 15,000 in payments to the QF from customers. And so I think where the LEI report didn't bring it up as a specific issue is recognizing that this is not a material driver in the economics of that QF when even the smallest QFs are in the hundreds of thousands of annual revenues per year.
Thank you. I appreciate your providing that perspective from Mr. Johnson's testimony. And as you can tell, it's a good thing that there are transcripts and the ability to remind ourselves of what each of these dockets include. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Mr. Snyder, I had just a couple of questions with regard to the Burns-McDonnell analysis. That analysis was asked. Did Duke ask Burns-McDonnell to use South Carolina, North Carolina specific information to derive that? That's not publicly available information, correct?
It is not. We used it solely for the purpose of the escalation rate and not the direct number to derive our avoided cost, consistent with past commission's orders on starting with a publicly available number. The issue we had, as I point out in my testimony, is that publicly available data can often be a bit delayed by the time the study is done and the report gets published. And so we only use the Burns and McDonnell data to escalate the publicly available data.
And it took me about to the end, I got to your testimony, but when you use the phrase technology specific with regard to that inflation rate, that's the technology specific is the replacement CT, is that correct? It's not talking about the technology neutral avoided cost.
Yeah, I apologize, Chair Belser.
No, that's my issue, but I just want to make sure I'm clear.
You're correct. That we use that term twice, and we should be clear when we use it. This was simply on the replacement, the CT cost, and that specific CT cost escalation factor in the peaker method, as opposed to a more general inflation for that peaker cost.
And I just want to look at your exhibit that accompanied your rebuttal, and the categories. I'm looking on the left. We've got EPC project capital cost, owner's cost, total overnight cost. Why is it total overnight cost? Can you explain that term to me?
Yeah, overnight cost just means this is a starting point for the derivation of the capacity rate, which is you get the cost to construct in overnight dollars, meaning it does not include AFUDC. And you then from there build out your capacity rate by including AFUDC, applying future for that overnight costs. Think of it as more the return of and on an annual basis, so that you can put that into an annual cost to carry that. And then the calculation looks to calculate the value that is created by avoiding those annual rate-based costs from the QF. That would include the overnight plus the AFUDC on a present value basis. And I think the LEI report, they went through a step-by-step process on how you start with the overnight and then end up at the rate.
And I think you probably answered this question in response to Commissioner Carolee Williams' questions, but when you were responding to Converse Energy's issue on page 8, lines 20, you used the phrase under updated, accurate, avoided cost rates. You're not saying that the prior avoided cost rates were not accurate, are you?
Not at all, Commissioner. I'm second round of rebuttal here, just re-emphasizing that we believe our updated rates themselves are accurate, and in no way were the old rates not accurate. It's just inappropriate to use old rates with new rates now available.
Well, and those old rates, you in responding to Commissioner Williams, you've referenced more granularity with regard to time periods and the rates that are calculated. Under the old methodology before Act 62 here in South Carolina, were there different time periods? Were there rates calculated for different time periods, or whether it's hours of the day or season?
There were, and I'm going to subject to check because I have not pulled them out lately, but there was only, I believe, 3 different, not 9, and not the different capacity buckets that we have today. So there were differentials for peak and off peak, but there were not differentials by season, by peak off. And in the case of winter, we have premium peak, and off peak, and day and night hours. So these 9 price buckets over the course of the year, broken up into 3 seasons with distinct capacity rates, is far more granular, Chair Belser, than what we had prior to Act 62, where we just had peak and off-peak rates. And I believe there may have been a third, maybe the peak were summer, winter, and then off-peak was year-round, but I would have to check on that. But I do remember them being far, far less granular. And one of the issues through the series of proceedings was to provide more granularity so that differing QFs could receive higher value if they could provide where there were hours or seasons with higher value, and QFs that could not would not be overcompensated. So this current rate structure was probably the subject of 2 or 3 avoided cost proceedings, where moving from less to more granular was a pretty significant component of those past proceedings.
And do non-solar QFs such as hydro, do they, are they compensated for capacity credit?
They are, to the extent they can provide when capacity has value. So we have DEC and DEP have slightly different capacity hours, but by and large, most capacity value is the winter morning hours. And to the extent the QF can provide energy across those winter morning hours, they will receive capacity value. To the extent they do not, they will not receive capacity value.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. That's all I have. Commissioners, anything further for this witness? Ms. DeMarco, any redirect? Thank you. Mr. Snyder, you may stand down. Thank you for your testimony today. We appreciate you being with us virtually.
I appreciate the opportunity to appear virtually. It has allowed me to attend some afternoon meetings that I appreciate your flexibility.
Well, I would have thought you might want to get out of some of those, but thank you.
Commissioner.
Does that complete Duke's case?
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Okay. I think that's all the witnesses. That is all the witnesses. And I failed to note at the beginning of the hearing that South Carolina Coastal Conservation League and the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy requested to be excused from today's hearing. Also, Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association had asked to be excused from today's hearing. Just want that on the record. Anything further from any party? Well, I think our staff council has requested proposed orders due October 18th. Is that workable? Needs to be.
If it needs to be, it needs to be, Madam Chair.
Well, that's the date we're shooting for. So thank you very much. And with that, we will close this proceeding and take this up at an upcoming disposition at an upcoming business meeting. Thank you very much. Everyone have a good day. We are adjourned.